Sorry.
There you go.
All right, well, Spencer, let me know when you want me to start.
Okay. We'll leave it one more minute, Michael, and then I'll introduce you.
It's all right, Spencer. I can admit people. I found the right screen now, so I can keep doing that if you want to do introductions.
Given that you're very eager, Michael, I'll get started then. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the SEND seminar series. I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues today, Professor Michael Thomas and Dr. Jo Van Herwegen. The talk is entitled Neuromyths about Neurodevelopmental Disorders, Misconceptions by Educators and the General Public. Michael is a Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Birkbeck, University of London. He is the Director of the Centre for Educational Neuroscience, which is a cross-institutional research centre that aims to further translational research between neuroscience and education and establish new transdisciplinary accounts in the learning sciences. Jo is an Associate Professor in Developmental Psychology at UCL Institute of Education and Director of the Child Development and Learning Difficulties Lab. Jo carries out research in child development with a special focus on learning difficulties and developmental disorders, with the aim to translate the latest findings into effective and practical assessments, as well as classroom-based practice and interventions. So without further ado, over to you, please, Michael.
Super. Thanks very much, Spencer, and a pleasure to be here today. So we're going to do a tag team. I'm going to start off and talk for 20 minutes to give a kind of general introduction to a new project that the CEN has undertaken. And then Jo is going to talk about some specific results from one of our initial studies. So Jo, if you want to go on to the next slide. Okay, so here's our title, Neuromyths about Neurodevelopmental Disorders, Misconceptions by Educators and the General Public. So Jo will be talking about the results of a specific study which we're trying to get published at the moment. It was a kind of large survey study carried out together with Sylvia Genie and Victoria Noland. So I'd like to thank Sylvia and Victoria for their help on the project. Before we do that, I want to make some sort of general comments about neuromyths and why we're interested in doing research in that area. Some of you might be wondering what a neuromyth is. Okay, so neuromyth is a misconception or a misunderstanding about how the brain works. And we identify these as sort of misunderstandings that have become fairly prevalent in the general public. And so examples that we only use 10% of our brain, or there are left brain thinkers and right brain thinkers. Neither of those claims are actually true. But often these myths have some original seed of truth about them. So it is true in the second of those examples that some functions are specialized to one hemisphere or the other in the brain. But you know, when our brain generates behavior, both sides are working together. Now, neuromyths held by teachers in principle could lead to classroom practice for which there's no evidence base. So for example, if you might try and classify your children into left brain thinkers and right brain thinkers and then give them different activities or different materials or so forth. So there is a risk that if there's a misconception like that around it, it could produce practices for which there's no evidence. Okay, Jo, next slide. Neuromyths, it turns out neuromyths has become a whole research field. Lots of people doing studies into people's misunderstanding of how the brain works. Quite often that research has been associated with kind of skepticism about the enterprise of educational neuroscience, the idea that any kind of understanding about the brain could be used to help improve educational outcomes. So you got to ask if with the Center for Educational Neuroscience, why we are adding to neuromyth research if it's kind of associated with a skeptical view of educational neuroscience. Next slide, Joe, if you would. Thanks. So if you're in this view of educational neuroskepticism, if you don't think any kind of data coming out of neuroscience is going to be relevant to education, there are a bunch of well, many of these I would view as legitimate criticisms. So Joe, press the space bar a few times, again and again, till all of these are filled, and stop there. Go back one. There you go. Okay, so so these are kind of criticisms that you'll see on the left-hand side of, I think, reasonable kind of criticisms you might make of the field, given that it's still an emerging field and relatively young, as it were. You might have sort of skepticism about really whether you can use neuroscience data for education. You know, these are the arguments that brain scans are never going to be relevant to producing lesson plans, for example. Or you could have concerns about the current practical operation of the field, that there's just not enough dialogue, bidirectional discussions between educators and neuroscientists and psychologists, that maybe it's too much preaching of academics to teachers or something like that. Or you could have concerns about you know, whether currently neuroscience methods are going to be useful in their current form. Is kind of genetics or our brain scans, are they actually going to be useful for, say, early diagnosis of developmental disorders? All of those, I think, are legitimate concerns and criticisms we can use to improve the field. On the other hand, what I take to be distractions are the ones in the column on the left. Neuromyths, these for me are a problem with science communication. These are misunderstandings, right? These don't actually bear on whether it's useful to use educational neuroscience or not. And we'll talk some more on the next slides about that. There's another field, that's kind of subfield, almost a cottage industry of people publishing on what's called the seductive allure of neuroscience. This is the claim that if you had some new teaching method and you wrote a document saying, oh, I think you should do this, and you put a picture of a brain scan on that document, people are more likely to believe it, okay? And again, that's been offered as skepticism about educational neuroscience, but for me, that's just a contextual framing issue, right? So to use an analogy from, say, medicine, you might be more likely to trust a doctor if she had neuroanatomy books on her bookshelf, right? That's just a framing issue. It doesn't bear on whether medicine is useful or not, right? And there's another example, like criticisms about commercial brain training techniques. And just because there are snake oil salesmen out there doesn't mean that there isn't some useful medicine out there at the same time. So that's why I view neuromyths generally as a kind of distraction from the enterprise of trying to advance a kind of multidisciplinary study of the learning sciences. Joe, could you jump on the next slide? Thanks. So yeah, normally I would say if I'm talking to people about educational neuroscience, can your understanding of mechanisms of learning help in the classroom? I tend to say, don't be impressed by kind of brain scans and stuff, and don't believe in neuromyths, right? Actually, we want to judge the field on whether it's producing practical benefits to children in the classroom and to educators and policymakers. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to think just for a couple of slides a little more deeply about neuromyths. And that's because I can be quite ambivalent about them. On the one hand, I think, you know, neuromyths are good. I don't like it that people don't have the right idea about how the brain works, but in a sense, they're good because they show that educators and the general public are interested in the brain. And also they're good because they imply that educators do think that an understanding of mechanisms of learning could be relevant to their practice. So reasons that neuromyths are not all a bad thing. Next slide. On the other hand, bad, obviously, because this is poor science communication. Potentially bad because if teachers have the wrong idea about how the brain works, in principle, it could lead to activities in the classroom that have no basis in fact. You know, if you think that most of the body's made of water, so kids can't be dehydrated, it'll stop them concentrating, you could end up having like water bottles everywhere and taking water breaks, which might not be needed at all. Although it has to be said, there's relatively limited evidence, and Jo can talk a bit more about this, that actually does correlations between the teacher's understanding of how the brain works and teaching quality and teaching outcomes. One of the things that concerns me is a bad aspect is that neuromyth research can get quite a lot of media coverage. And it's kind of appeals to sort of clickbait idea of, you know, stories that everything you thought you knew is wrong type stories. You know, actually red wine and chocolate are good for you. These kind of things that make people click on stories. That kind of can squeeze out the actual educational neuroscience findings, that, you know, the actual progress that we're making in the field. And as part of this wider media narrative in some sectors, that, you know, scientists don't really know anything, you know, all this stuff, they made you think that only 10% of the brain is being used, but actually, you know, we don't really know anything about that. And I have concerns if it's undermining the kind of careful evidence accumulation that we're trying to advance in the field of educational neuroscience. Next slide. So what will my general conclusion be? Well, that we need to be careful about neuromyths. My main interest is in advancing educational neuroscience. I don't want to spend too much time on dispelling myths. And indeed, I think we have to dispel them gently, because people might say, well, if that's not how the brain works with this whole 10%, well, how does it work? And until we have a good story there to come back, you know, I think we need to be gentle in how we deal with neuromyths. Next slide. So we have done some work around this in the Center for Educational Neuroscience. Mainly we're trying to do the basic research, the basic translation itself. But if you go to our website, you will find this resource called NeuroHit or Neuromyth. And you'll see a list of articles that we put together on popular myths. Are these myths or are they real? What is the evidence base around them? Where do these ideas come from? As in the middle, we only use 10% of our brain, or children do better in school if they were born in the autumn. Is that real or not? If you're interested, what pages that get the most hits, actually by far the most, is the one in the middle. Violent video games make children more violent, and that gets an awful lot of internet hits from North America for some reason. You will see at the bottom of this page, so this is a screenshot from the website, the project we'll be talking about today. So it was first advertised on our website, and there it says, the CEN has launched a new project called Neuroscience to explore people's beliefs about the brain and people with special educational needs. We'd love your help in completing a short questionnaire. Click on this link to take the survey. And so, Jo, I don't know whether that link is still active or not. I probably wouldn't click on it yourself, but because we've finished data analysis. But the data that Jo will be presenting comes from this particular survey. Okay, next slide. Okay, so why the move into special educational needs and disabilities? What is the relevance of neuromyths there? Well, actually, I think in the field of developmental cognitive neuroscience, we do know quite a lot about a sort of mechanistic understanding of what is causing developmental deficits in different kinds of disorders. So should you have, in loose change in your pockets, £796.03, you can go to the Amazon site and order all 5 volumes of Thomas and Carmel Smith's collected papers on neurodevelopmental disorders, and you can see actually this is we're edited volume of all the leading most important papers historically in the study of developmental disorders, looking at different disorder types, and the original work identifying autism as a disorder going back to the 1940s. Looking at different types of behaviorally defined disorder, and so ADHD and dyslexia and autism and so forth. looking at genetically defined developmental disorders like Down syndrome and Fragile X syndrome, looking at disorders caused by environmental influences such as prenatal viral infections from the mother or fetal alcohol syndrome, and then some of the contemporary multidisciplinary approaches to developmental disorders. So there is a very big body of research to try and understand what the mechanistic causes are of various different developmental disorders. And the question we're interested in is, well, how much of that has been translated into classroom practice? And indeed, how much of that research is potentially relevant to classroom practice, to helping teachers, helping educators generate the best educational outcomes for children with special educational needs. Next slide. So if you think about translation, our suspicion is really most of the translation from this basic level of research has been within clinical settings and within diagnosis. And it tends to have focused around literacy, development, language, and numeracy. But one can envisage different possibilities about how a better understanding of the causes of developmental disorders could help teachers. For example, we could imagine that it might help teachers understand the characteristic profiles of different disorders, some of the principal commonalities and dimensions of difference, how all kids with autism might be similar, but the other ways in which they commonly vary. One could think about helping educators understand what I've called developmental change here, but what are the principal manifestations and difficulties of a disorder at different ages, as say in early childhood, middle childhood, and in adolescence. And then to try and present the evidence-based techniques, what the evidence base is of the techniques that can help with difficulties in the classroom. So I'm thinking here in terms of problems with attention or impulsivity, distractibility, children who struggle with their working memory or with social engagement, social skills, or with, say, having perceptual sensitivity, or maybe in a sort of more physical dimension, dyspraxia or developmental coordination disorder. Now, of course, these are possibilities that we like to explore, and you can find skepticism about that. You can find the view that really to do things in the classroom with children, it's about experience. It's about sort of from a therapeutic point of view. You just look at the behavior and you just use the best kind of intervention available for that. So I don't need to know the causes of dyslexia. I just need to know that if a child has that diagnosis, I need to do work on their phonology, and I need to give them decoding practice and so forth. So you will find people who are saying that an understanding of mechanism may not be important. And I think we're going to argue against that, and today, either during this talk or in the questions, we will try and articulate why we think that's an understanding of mechanism is important. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're getting closer to the actual project we're going to talk about today. So the idea is to understand whether and how developmental cognitive neuroscience findings can be translated into useful recommendations for classroom practice. We first need to sort of begin at the beginning to find out right now what teachers know about developmental disorders of the brain and whether their knowledge is influencing their practice. So that's the goal of our initial study, is to try and begin there, to then move on and think about, well, can we go further than that, and what aspects of the basic research could be translatable. And as we'll probably talk about at the end, a lot of that is going to come from a dialogue with teachers rather than us answering that question as researchers. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to 2 or 3 more slides before I hand over to Jo, and just to give some background about what the current pedagogy is for special educational needs. And I'm going to say there isn't one, right? Interesting. That kind of surprised me when I first came into this area. Why is that? Well, Teaching practices for children with special educational needs is generally subsumed under the broader concept or umbrella of differentiation and individualization. So I'll just put up a recent paper there showing research in these kind of concepts. This one by Lindner and Schwab, published in 2020. It's a systematic review, and they talk about concepts there. It's a methodological shift from the traditional one-size-fits-all model to individualized teaching and learning. The kind of concepts they talk about are collaboration and teamwork, instructional practices, organizational practices, and socio-emotional behavioral practices. So in this view, you don't need a specific pedagogy for SEN because you're already trying to have teaching practices that are tailored to the individual child. And there is, of course, the issue that the children with a given diagnosis or label can vary an awful lot. So maybe it's not that useful just to say, if a child has this label, use these kind of methods and practices. Next slide, please. So we did look back to the previous literature, and this is quite an old review carried out by Davis and Florian in 2004. Actually, our research team is quite keen to update this, but this was a review of the teaching strategies and approaches for pupils with SEN, commissioned by the Department for Education and published back in 2004. And what you're looking at there is these authors pulled out for various kind of difficulties in the literature at the time, what kind of teaching strategies were recommended. So for example, communication and interaction, the teaching strategies would be that these children benefit from mainstream education and additional support mechanisms, that they benefit from intense interaction if part of profound multiple learning difficulties, less evidence on effective structures for autistic spectrum disorder, and so forth. So I won't go through this table, and I'm happy to share it for those who are interested. Joe, if you want to press, that's good. So I'll just pull out a couple of quotes, which I found interesting from the paper. So Davis and Florian said the teaching approaches and strategies identified in this review were not sufficiently differentiated from those which are used to teach all children to justify a distinct SEN pedagogy. And indeed, they said there's little evidence for distinctive teaching approaches for children with specific learning difficulties. But their advice was, overall, responding to individual differences is crucial. The key to appropriate teaching lies in careful and ongoing assessment linked to teaching. But their view was there's no kind of magic bullet that one method will be absolutely best. You only have to use one method with a child with a given difficulty. They said instead a combination of strategies produce more powerful effects than a single strategy solution. So advocating a multiple method approach. Joe, press the space bar again. Thanks. They did identify some holes in the literature at that point. They said most research is on younger children, where there's strong evidence in support of early intervention across all areas of need, with the exception of social and emotional development and research on self-determination. Few studies focused on older learners, so that the weight of the research seems to have been in early and mid-childhood and relatively less on the kind of difficulties faced in the adolescent years. And also, and I'll finish here, they say there's little research that takes account of the diversity of contexts in which strategies need to be applied. And I think this is an area where an understanding of mechanism can, in principle, offer a benefit. That if you have some set of strategies that you've been told will work with a child with a particular disorder or a particular kind of behavioral difficulty, we all know that these strategies don't work with all children. They work with some children and not others, and they may work in some contexts and not other contexts. And I think if teachers have an understanding about the mechanisms underlying the deficits and why the methods sometimes work, it gives the teacher much more autonomy to try and figure out how they may adapt these kind of strategies to work with different children and in different contexts. Okay, so next slide, Joe. that's me, and I will hand over to Jo to talk about the specifics of our initial kind of scoping studies in Neuromyths and SEN. Over to you, Jo.
Sorry, my mouse is a bit funny today. Thank you, Michael. So thank you for that introduction. So this is what motivated us to look at what are the neuromyths around neurodevelopmental disorders. Although there has been a little bit, well, no consistent evidence that it impacts the endorsement of neuromyths impacts on teaching practices, we do know that it could form the basis of stigma. And, you know, as Michael already introduced, we think that understanding of mechanisms might help teachers in terms of their educational practice. So let me just move on to which neurodevelopmental disorders we focused on. So we focused first of all on autism spectrum disorders, due to the fact that it forms a large part of the SEN population. So as many of you may well be aware, 1% of the population has a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders. And there has been a previous study that looked at the neuromyths related to ASD. Actually, a focus group research showed that there are 7 common ASD neuromyths. 4 of those are related to the social dimensions of the disorder, so including the beliefs that children on the spectrum do not like to be touched or are disinterested in any social relationships, don't have a need for any friends, and therefore are very happy to transition to another school, for example. Whereas obviously we know that children with autism do like to be touched, but maybe have like to be touched in a different way because of their sensory processing differences, and are very much interested in friendships and social relationships. Another neurodevelopmental disorder we looked at was ADHD, again, because it's highly prevalent, with a prevalence of 1.4% in the UK. And again, there's been one study that has examined on the neuromyths related to ADHD. This was it was a questionnaire study, a survey study that was administered to 256 teachers. And what this study showed was that teachers did endorse a number of neuromyths related to ADHD. One of them, for example, being that special diets might be an effective treatment for ADHD disorder. So this was one that was endorsed by 34% of teachers. And this study also showed that actually the endorsement of some of these neuromyths led to some stigma as well by teachers around who they would refer for a diagnosis or who they would not refer, for example. Another neurodevelopmental disorder is dyslexia, as it's a common neurodevelopmental disorder that affects 1 in 10 people in the UK. There have been a few studies that have examined neuromyths related to dyslexia. So McDonald et al. 2017 and Washburn et al. 2014. And common neuromyths includes myths such as children with dyslexia see letters backwards. So this was by McDonald, was 1 in 2 people endorsed this. Another one was by Washburn et al., who found that 91% of UK teachers believe dyslexia to be at least partly due to a deficit in visual perceptions. So around, you know, they might see letters differently. It's due to how they visually perceive these letters, and visual color displays may work. And a lot of UK teachers, 97% in this study, believed that children could outgrow dyslexia with more practice. I don't have time to go and explain which one of these are true or not true and why, or what the evidence is, but another neurodevelopmental disorder we focused on is Down syndrome, again, because it's from the genetic neurodevelopmental disorders, it's a very common one, with 1 in 1,000 live births. And again, the neuromyths related to Down syndrome have been researched in a qualitative study by Kologon in 2013. And a common neuromyth related to individuals with Down syndrome is what a child with learning difficulties can understand can be measured by what the child can say. However, as many of you may know, in Down syndrome, there are particular issues with production of speech. And although there are some issues with comprehension, the issues related to production of speech are often greater than their difficulties with language understanding. So, as I mentioned in previous studies, there has been a focus on neuromyths related to neurodevelopmental disorders, but these studies often focused on one particular disorder. And so it's unclear how these different neuromyths relate, whether they're particular for one developmental disorder or go across different developmental disorders. So in the current study, we were interested in comparing the endorsement of general neuromyths compared to endorsements related to neurodevelopmental neuromyths, as well as comparing the endorsements from educators versus those of the general public. A number of previous studies that examined the endorsement of general neuromyths have shown that educators tend to endorse fewer myths because of the fact they might have particular courses or have received some education around educational neuroscience or neuroscience more generally. And we were also interested in kind of factors that may impact on incorrect beliefs, such as, for example, an interest in neuroscience or experience with a particular neurodevelopmental disorder, to see if that might mitigate the endorsement. So our particular predictions, and I've written them out, but obviously all of my screens are in the way to seeing them in full, so I need to move some of them. There you go. So based on the existing literature, it was predicted that all groups would endorse at least some neuromyths. And that's also because the evidence basis of some of these neuromyths isn't always quite clear, or there isn't sometimes a fixed answer yet. Based on the exposure to educational training or direct experience, it was predicted that mainstream class teachers would hold fewer incorrect beliefs than the general public. We also therefore predicted an interaction between the type of myth, so general versus neurodevelopmental disorder, and group, thinking that again, there would be fewer endorsements by mainstream teachers for neurodevelopmental as well as general. With respect to the role of familiarity with the disorders and the role of interest in the brain, based on previous studies, we predicted that those with more familiarity with the disorder would hold fewer incorrect beliefs, and that those with an interest in the brain and those who regularly access information about the brain would hold more incorrect beliefs. And that was based on one particular previous study that had been done. However, other studies have also found that an interest in information about the brain actually can be beneficial, so making you endorse fewer. And these predictions were then tested separately for the general public and those working in education. That was just from a statistical point of view. Okay, a little bit more information around our participants. So in general, we had 569 participants. 203 of those worked in education and 366 were part of the general public. We also asked questions around, whether they had a child with a learning disability themselves, or whether they themselves had a formal disability diagnosis. And we also looked at the highest level of education. As you can see, there were no differences in terms of whether they had a disability themselves or whether they had a child with a learning disability. But as you can see, there's slightly differences in terms of level of education, with those working in education having slightly higher levels of education than the general public. And that will be relevant later on for when we come to the conclusions. When we say in education, we did have quite a varied pool of participants, with 44% being teachers in both primary and secondary and early years. We had some teaching assistants or LSAs, and we also had a small sample of SENCOs. In reality, originally we had hoped that that would have been a larger proportion, so we could also make comparisons between teachers, just general teachers compared to SENCOs, to see whether the SENCOs would endorse fewer or have different types of knowledge. We also had some head teachers, deputy head teachers, people who worked in administration in the school. We've excluded those from the data analysis. It was a small proportion. And then we had others, and that could be people in higher education as well as an educational psychologist. So we had some really a varied pool when we talk about those in education. The survey consists of 4 different sections. So the first section asked around general knowledge and general neuromyths. So these are myths that have been really well researched in the past. There were 15 of them. And Michael already presented some of those at the very beginning around, the 10% of brain and whether your typical learning style or whether drinking water would help. And then we had 40 neuromyths related to neurodevelopmental disorders that were then drawn from the previous studies that we put together. Then we had a section on demographics and a final section that I won't be able to talk about today, but might be interesting to look at in another talk or another presentation, looking at what are the teaching methods that teachers are using in their daily practice. Oh, this is slide would have helped. So we've got 15 true or false statements around the brain, and which participants had to rate on a Likert point from on a 4-point Likert scale, so from true, probably false, and false. And 30 statements of neurodevelopmental disorders. So we started with 40, but cut them down. So there's a little bit of a more equal division between those related to autism, ADHD, Down syndrome, and dyslexia. And again, on a 4-point Likert scale. The general neuromyths, generally they are rated on a true, false, and I don't know. We changed this to a 4-point Likert scale because, as I mentioned before, the evidence base for some of these neurodevelopmental neuromyths is not always as clear-cut as true, false, don't know. So that's why we kind of changed it to true, probably false, and false. This is the overview of our 15 neuromyths about the general brain, which I can go quickly through it. Here are a few of the ones that we included related to neurodevelopmental disorders. So dyslexia can be helped by using colored lenses or colored overlays relating to the neuromyth that dyslexia might be caused by some visual problems. For children with autism are unable to notice social rejection relating to the social difficulties that children with autism may have. As I already mentioned before, a very common one is this one related to dietary changes in ADHD. So reducing dietary intake of sugar or food additives is an effective method of reducing the symptoms of ADHD. And those who are dyslexic tend to have lower IQ scores than those who are not dyslexics. All of those, as mentioned before, drawn from previous studies and often endorsed by either general public or educators. So what did we find in our results? So as you can see here from the means, there was no, we ran an ordered logistic regression. And as you can see from the means, there was no significant difference between the endorsements of general neuromyths for those who worked in education compared to those who did not work in education. However, there was a slight difference when it comes to, and again, there was no difference between those working in education, those not working in education for the myths related to special educational needs or neurodevelopmental disorders. However, as you can see, the score, so in this case, the higher the score, the better, right? In that they had it more likely correct because we rescored some of the true and false ones. And as you can see, the scores for the neurodevelopmental myths were lower than those for the general neuromyths in both those in education and the general public. And that's basically what this slide says. So there is a significant difference for the type of neuromyth that is endorsed, but no significant difference for whether you work in education or not, and there's no interaction either. We also ran some correlations between the accuracy on general and neurodevelopmental neuromyths, and you can see that in both groups, these correlate with one another. So if you endorsed more general neuromyths, then people endorsed also more neurodevelopmental Neuromids. When it came to looking at what kind of factors might influence the endorsement of Neuromids, and again, we put in the type in there, as well as are you interested in information about your brain? How often do you access information about your brain? Are you familiar with neurodevelopmental disorders? And we looked at the various interactions between familiarity and type, as well as interested. And are you interested in in the brain, facts about the brain, and how often do you access that information? And when we look at educators or people working in education, what you'll see is that there is one strong predictor, which is how often do you access information about the brain, was a protective factor. So it was the people were more interested in people who accessed the information more, endorsed fewer Neuromids, but there was no interactions that we found. Also, there was no significance, although there seems to be something nearing there around being interested in the brain. For the general public, we see that same kind of factor that plays a role. So again, how often do you access information about the brain was a protective factor. In this case, the are you interested in knowledge about your brain was just significant, but we also see that familiarity with the neurodevelopmental disorder played a role in here. But again, it didn't matter whether there was no effect for type of neuromyth, and no interactions were significant. Because we found for the general public an effect for familiarity with a neurodevelopmental disorder, we did some further exploratory analysis. And what it shows here is how, so the accuracy for the different neurodevelopmental groups. And I know it's very small, but this is your general Neuromids, Down syndrome, dyslexia, Down syndrome, ASD, and ADHD. And this is for people in education as well as those in the general population. And what you can see, although it might not be that obvious, but actually you can see that the green dot here on the left is higher for related to Neuromids related to autism. And that's the case for both those working in education and those for the general population. So there's higher scores, so fewer endorsements of the Neuromids compared to some of the other groups. For example, such as Down syndrome, and the general Neuromids. We then did some, based upon that, we did some further T-tests on the accuracy for those working in education and those who did not work in education for each of the different developmental disorders. So looking at, do educators versus general public endorse either more or less Neuromids related to autism, ADHD, dyslexia, or Down syndrome. And as you can see, there were no significant differences, although, there seems to be a trend for ADHD. And this again confirms the earlier regression analysis that familiarity with the disorder did not impact on the ability to recognize neurodevelopmental Neuromids in either of our groups. So that was a study. So what we can conclude from this is that there's no significant difference in the number of beliefs held in those working in education compared to the general population for either type of Neuromids, despite higher levels of education that we saw for those working within education. But obviously, it's a little bit unclear how much education on neurodevelopmental disorders the educators had specifically, because we had a very wide group of participants and we didn't recruit a lot of SENCO. So, moving forward, so Michael, to answer your question, the link is still active in that we hope to recruit further SENCOs and special educational needs teachers to complete the survey. The general Neuromyths were less endorsed compared to previous studies. So if we look, for example, at Decker et al. And Ruhak and Cook that used the same general Neuromids, we find that in their study, Neuromids were the correct answer to Neuromyths was around 70 in these to 75 in these studies, whereas in our studies we find 90 to 95% of correct answers to Neuromyths. So they're less endorsed, so a higher proportion of correct scores. And the way we've interpreted this, it seems that, there's been a number of initiatives, one by the Center of Educational Neuroscience with the NeuroHit and Neuromyth, but as Michael has mentioned before, there's been a lot of talk around what are Neuromyths, which ones work, guess what you didn't know yesterday that you know now, you do not just use 10% of your brain. These initiatives seem to be paying dividends. We were surprised, well, we kind of predicted that there was going to be differences, but obviously there's been a difference in the amount of incorrect or the Neuromyths endorsed related to neurodevelopmental disorders. The idea that these awareness campaigns might help is also seen when it comes to neurodevelopmental disorders, Neuromyths, in terms of the fact that Neuromyths related to autism were less endorsed. And again, there's been a number of awareness campaigns and the Autism Act in 2009 and the drive in the last 2 years by various autism charities that teachers should be educated about autism and what it looks like in the classroom. And again, that kind of ties in with the idea that in both groups, we found that those who accessed the information about the brain did better and endorsed fewer Neuromyths. So it's a promising finding in as much as it suggests that the possibility of improving knowledge around Neuromyths might be by further dissemination of accurate information. Of course, there are a number of limitations in our study, which is, first of all, the fact that we would hope to recruit more Senkos. But we're also aware that there are different routes into teaching, and that when we talk about the teachers in our studies, there are a number of different routes they might have taken. There are also a number of different roles and experiences these teachers may have. So we might want to look in a more finer grained analysis of these different types of routes. We didn't ask around to different types of routes, so it will be for another study in the future. And it's a little bit unclear, although, interest in the brain was a protective factor. But obviously, we don't know what information about the brain respondents were accessing and how the endorsements of myths might actually impact on practice and educational outcomes. And as I mentioned, Michael mentioned before, is that there are not many studies out there that have actually looked at whether or not the endorsement of myths matters at all. So this leaves us with a few steps for the future. One is, do these myths actually impact on teaching and learning? And how do we best address them? If we know that information dissemination can help, how do we disseminate this information to teachers as well as obviously the general public? And as such, I can kind of then ask you to come and take part in our next step, which is Neuroscience, making sense of Neuromyths. We have a number of events lined up to talk and hear from teachers, Senkos and sense specialists around what this all means in terms of classroom practice. And our first event is on the 23rd of June. And I'll put the link to register if you haven't already done so, because I know the event was circulated around the Sen yesterday. If you haven't done so, I'll put it in the chat. And we can now open the floor for any questions, and I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Jo and Michael. That was super interesting. I'll start with the questions from the chat then. There was a question by a guy that Michael responded to, which was, how do we improve the state of play? In line with your last slide there, these awareness campaigns seem to work, which is very interesting. A comment by Maureen then, could it be there is little in the literature because teachers aren't writing research papers? So they have the experience of working in certain classrooms, but they're not writing research papers. Is that a possibility?
There not being like a pedagogy around SEN different developmental disorders, or that was a while ago. I forgot I'd even put that in there.
No problem.
I don't know whether Michael wants to take this one first or me, but I think it comes to the fact that, you know, that's exactly what I personally believe we, you know, where we could further the field is by working closer with teachers around what they're doing in the classroom and how we evaluate that practice. I think, you know, I think that's what researchers should be doing. That's what researchers are for, is that we have the tools to evaluate what's happening, but we're not educators. You know, we would like to leave that to the educators themselves. And on the CEN website, Michael, Thomas and I have written a couple of years ago some guidance around how you can evaluate practice, and we'd always be interested to hear from teachers around if there are any particular practices they would like to evaluate and how we can help that research. Don't know, Michael, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's some practical things about where best practice is emerging from the classroom, about whether we have a platform to bring that together and disseminate it, quite apart from any of the research that's going on. I would agree with Jay that I think for us, we as researchers need to hear more about how things look in the classroom. And if ideas about things that seem like they work for some kids, and exactly how different kids these days can be who under current practice are assigned a given diagnostic label, because that diagnostic practices change from time to time and region to region, and getting a better sense of these days, what does a dyslexic child or a child with ADHD look like in the classroom compared to say 10 years ago? There is a risk for researchers who will wander off into their specialist areas. For instance, there's a huge amount of research done on face recognition in different developmental disorders, which is theoretically very interesting, but maybe that's not the most important issue for teaching kids with social impairments in the classroom, and allowing educators to bring researchers back to the most important issues, I think is a really important aspect of this work.
I feel like this has been in my kind of interaction with neuroscience or educational neuroscience, this has been something that comes up all the time, is that we're not getting, I'm an educator, I'm an SEN specialist teacher, and I just wonder when it's going to happen, because I'm ready.
Well, we've just started, we've got funding to get it going, and hopefully, you know, if we get a few successful events and some great ideas, then we'll probably be in a good position to get some further funding. So, Marina, I do hope you'll join us on our next session and the debate around how we can make that happen.
In respect to that then, Joe, there's a comment from Naomi. Is it feasible to run some studies in collaboration with CEN and schools to measure impact of different learning methods? So I'm guessing the answer is possibly yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's always possibilities. You know, sometimes research happens with researchers having an idea and ask for schools to take part, but I think it works also very well the other way around, where schools saying, hey, we've got a need, we would like to do this. And, you know, if you researchers can help us evaluate a practice, then I think that would be a win-win situation, really. Yeah,
agreed. And there's also a follow-up to Maureen's comments regarding training for teachers then. There's a comment from Dr. V. Wolf. I'm assuming she might be an EdPsych in the UK. And her comment is that she's been trying to influence teacher training institutions to implement aspects related to but with limited success. I guess there's an issue too with like policy, for example, in teacher training situations.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, you know, part of this is our frustration with trying to deal with teacher training and how you get this knowledge into the system. And where there was a move certainly in the UK to make teacher training more kind of an apprenticeship, so much more experience-based in the classroom, that really reduces the opportunities to feed this kind of information into the system, and kind of pushes it down to the teachers' opportunities to do continuing professional development. But with the government's move to the early career framework and trying to identify more clearly what knowledge teachers should have, it's great that there is more emphasis on cognition in that framework. And I think once that door is now open a crack, there may be more opportunities to move forward and put information about developmental disorders into the early career framework.
Yeah. I think this question, Michael, from or Jo is, or both, from Sarah is quite important. You mentioned stigma early in your talk. Will your research explore how neuromyths influence stigma in the classroom and also how families are supported?
At the moment, we haven't looked at what that means, the endorsement related to stigma in classroom practice, but we will hope it. So with the funding we've obtained, we can do a few sessions where we'll get teachers' input around what does this mean for classroom practices, and some of that will be around stigma. As I mentioned, other studies have mentioned, it might relate to who you think might have a certain label, who might need to be referred for a diagnostic review. An EHCP review, for example, would be the most common one these days, compared to who not, because, they don't read letters backwards. So, it's unlikely to be dyslexia, this kind of idea that, how these myths might lead to certain practice.
Yeah. And related to that, then a question from, or statement from Andauka in the chat, I guess related to that last point about stigma, then to what extent is the problem exacerbated by promotion of the myths in popular culture? I think it's what Michael said to kind of start.
Yeah, I agree that that's frustrating because these things really are clickbait. And if everyday science is not that exciting, right? It's a gradual accumulation of an evidence base, and if you are rigorously working out whether some method works or not, you're looking at randomized controlled trials, and they take time and so forth. And maybe it's us as scientists, we don't come up with zippy enough headlines, even from the results of our trials. We typically end up saying, well, actually, we can't exactly tell what's going on. We need to run another study and so forth. So I think that there is probably missing expertise and missing government investment in translation, in specialists who are trying to do the translation, who are trying to take what we do know and make it in a form that is exciting and interesting and engaging for practitioners.
Yeah, exactly. I'll read a comment from Michelle. 1 second, the chat's moving up as I'm trying to read it. Beyond more obvious myths, I struggle as a specialist tutor in HE for students with dyslexia to access clear assessment of real debates in science around dyslexia, such as noting that there are no unambiguous object diagnostic criteria for dyslexia, in part because this term is understood in multiple ways. We discuss its relevance for informing education assessment, intervention and resourcing. We conclude by highlighting how current approaches to dyslexia diagnosis and remediation typically fail to serve the needs of large numbers of struggling readers. So I guess that, to summarize, that is probably about there needs to be clearer information regarding assessment type, classification type, and how that can be impacted for teachers and those that really need it. So I am mindful that it's 5 o'clock. Thank you very much, Jo and Michael, for your time. Obviously, that was a very provocative and emotive talk today, and hopefully your paper gets published, which would be great to read in itself. And we will, from a SEM point of view, we will see you next week. And thank you very much for your time. And once again, thank you, Michael and Jo.
Thank you.